Good morning, everyone. I think we're at 10:26, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our presentation, Discover and Analyze, Building Licensed Data Collections at the University of California, Berkeley with Dataverse. My name is Anna Sackmann, and I am the Data Services Librarian at UC Berkeley, and I'm here today with my colleague, Lynne Grigsby, who is the head of Library IT. I don't know if that's your actual head. Yeah, close enough. Damn it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about just data as collections within the academic library and some of the challenges that we've worked with infrastructure and workflow, and the solution that we came to through an open source repository. I think you know which one I'm talking about. And we'll go over the technical workflows that we developed working with Dataverse. And then I will wrap things up by talking about our licensing, our data licensing process, and our data acquisition workflow that we've developed. So a little bit about data acquisitions at UC Berkeley and kind of in general. I think that data as part of the collection of an academic library is a relatively new concept. There will be some social sciences librarians out there who say that, well, I've been doing this for 50 years, which is true, but by and large, in the scope of things, purchasing data to be part of our collection in the academic library didn't start happening until relatively recently. But that's not to say that we haven't been working with data and metadata for a very long time. And because this information type provided by libraries is newer, we've had to develop workflows for how to license, acquire, store, and make them discoverable with the same technological infrastructure that we use for monographs, journals, ebooks, et cetera. And this presents us with a bit of a square peg in a round hole scenario in which the process of acquisition through to discovery is sort of just good enough. So at the UC Berkeley Library, we began purchasing data in earnest, I would say maybe about 15 years ago. And we've been iterating on how it's been managed and how we've been working through that process ever since. I think that similarly to how we educate researchers on making their research data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as collection managers, we need to strive for the same principles with our acquired data. Data at UC Berkeley is constantly being purchased by individuals, faculty, researchers, with their grant funds or whatever. But when the library purchases data, it's a much different process. We have a very lengthy licensing and negotiation process, and we focus on two big pieces. Namely, is that our data is licensed for all UC Berkeley users. So it has to be available to that first-year student who is playing around with data maybe for the first time, clear to postdoctoral researchers or maybe folks in administration or staff at UC Berkeley who want to be using the data. And as you probably heard Rachel Sandberg talk yesterday, we strive to preserve fair use. So a couple of challenges. I'm not going to cover all of our data challenges because that would take up all of our time, but I'll highlight two big challenges over the next two slides. The first challenge that we faced with having data in our collections was the process of getting it into our library catalog. And you can see here from this example that one data set that we purchased different years of and different versions of is cataloged as 3 different information types. It's really tiny up there on the screen, but we have one data set cataloged as database, book, and other. And while you might be thinking, oh, this could be remedied with more consistency with cataloging, but it's difficult, if not impossible, for a cataloger to know everything, even a little bit, about a data set, particularly with the volume of items that they are cataloging every day. Our previous workflow for data acquisition was really similar to all of our other electronic resources, but we found that despite our best efforts, there were often gaps in communication between our acquisitions unit, library IT, and the liaison who ordered the data. And all of these people are wonderful. They're very good at their job. So this was to no fault of their own. For example, the data that Library IT received to load onto one of our servers, they got it from the vendor and maybe it was not in the preferred format or it was lacking proficient documentation, and there was no way for Library IT to know that what they were receiving wasn't exactly what the liaison wanted. We also didn't have a unified approach on how to handle data licenses. And as we all know, these have different components than other resources that we license. And this continues to remain a factor, particularly with AI. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Lynne, who will discuss the needs of the UC Berkeley Library.
Well, I'm not really going to discuss all the needs of the UC Berkeley Library, but we'll start in regards to data sets and data management. We started the evaluation process in 2021 of what we wanted to do to handle our data sets. And due to other workloads, I just want to point out Berkeley also implemented Alma in the summer of 2021 during COVID and did a library website major rewrite in 2022. So Dataverse was not our first priority, but we selected it. We went through the process and selected it in 2022. We just implemented it in October of 2024. And that is not against Dataverse. That had a lot to do with our process and policies. During that time, we did requirements gathering to determine what we wanted to cover. This included authentication and licensing, business processes, cataloging and discovery, large data sets, handling, management functionality, and technical. And I'm going to speak most about the technical, which intersects with a number of those other ones. But we run a number of applications for the UC Berkeley Library, and these range from large enterprise applications to small support applications. One of my favorites, which I'm just going to give it a plug, is the Graphic Arts Loan Collection, which is a way that we lend out original lithographs, etchings, and wood block prints to students. And if you ever have a meeting with some of our administration, you'll see them behind them in the pictures on Zoom. And it's really a fascinating project. But now about data. Our first criteria was simple, is that it had to be managed by Library IT and run locally. Why? Because we had no budget. And staff is not, I don't know about you, but staff is never considered quite as much a budget cost as actually paying for a service. So naturally, we aimed for something that was straightforward to implement and manage, which led us to try a few systems before we selected one. It also had to have consistent with our library IT infrastructure, which is Linux. We wanted a strong developer community because I don't know about you, but working in isolation isn't usually successful, and being able to reach out to others to ask questions is really an advantage, and Dataverse had a large community. And as we said, we prefer solutions that don't keep us up at night. And of course, from experience, we've also learned that we don't want to do a lot of extensive development or customization, because when that next upgrade comes out, we want to be able to upgrade and not be a 3-month project while we re-implement all of the bells and whistles we put on. And then we love Shibboleth. It's great. I don't understand why it's not easier at every campus. It seems like you would say, oh, we want Shibboleth, plug. But it's not. And we actually had to implement Shibboleth for 2 institutions, Berkeley and LB&L, the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, that we provide library services for. One of the major things is not in this service is not everyone can get everything. We needed a certain level of authentication and authorization that would handle that. One of the big wants that we'd had for years before, and we had actually looked at for cataloging, is how to point the user to the licensing agreement so that it would answer, we could say, you did X. Go read this and you'll see you're not supposed to do X. So that was a way. I also, as head of library IT, wanted to move away from being the bottleneck, because we would get, here's the data set, and it wasn't always as quickly as the users or the library wanted. Discovery was also the big thing. This system makes all metadata publicly available, even if the files are restricted. So somebody can ask about something, even though they can't necessarily get it. It's not self-serve. We wanted URLs that could be searchable, shareable. We wanted faceted search. And we also wanted to meet Berkeley's accessibility requirements. As this was a Harvard project and they met the Harvard digital accessibility policy, we felt it was ahead of the curve for some of the other systems we looked at. Once we selected Dataverse, then came implementation, which as some people hate that I say, you know, devil's in the details, always sounds good, and then you open the cover. So again, it's managing data sets has been a long-term issue for library IT. One of the things I want to mention is what is a data set? When I started and somebody said, Lynne, we're going to start giving you data sets. In my naivete, I thought, oh, it's just like getting PDFs or images. It'll all work out. And no, it's not. We have had data sets that are 7.8 terabytes. We have data sets that have 800,000 files. Getting them all together and loading them is a bit of a challenge. So we also want to streamline delivery because the way we currently do it, or were doing it before Dataverse, is you basically got that directory listing when you go to a server and you say, give me everything in this directory. It was a list. When you have 800,000 files, or as some vendors do, which I found out, it's files within files within files within files. It's like 15 layers down. You finally get to that file you want. But I will say that the biggest challenge we had with implementation is that we had a project team of 3 people. And within the 2 years of implementation, they each had babies. And they each took leave. So it was a challenge, a very exciting challenge, but a challenge nevertheless. You know, when you don't have a lot of depth of staff, those things impact you and you have to be fluid. And then one of the big questions was, where would we store data sets? We already had them. We already had them on servers. Could we just point Dataverse to them? We did a lot of testing of the pros and cons, and we actually did decide we're going to migrate everything into Dataverse. It was a better user experience to have them in the system than being pointed to. And so that was something like, okay, now we need to do that. And then, of course, the big question often is, where are all our data sets? The other day, Anna and I found a new one that wasn't on any list. When you've been doing it for 15 years, things have a way of being squirreled away. And so the nice thing about Dataverse is it supports loading from the UI. And so Anna loads a lot of, and her team load a lot of the data sets, but it doesn't handle the large data sets. It has a lot of tools for handling the large data sets, but you sort of need back-end experience. And that's not really how how we usually support our staff. So we're actually building Dio Valente, which is going to be our loading application that we actually hope to use for other systems also, but we're starting out with Dataverse. So now that we've launched Dataverse, our big next step is we're doing an in-depth accessibility review. And so it looked, initially we had already done one and it looked good, but now we're doing more details about it. And so back to Anna.
If anyone helps us want to figure out what these random data sets are that Lynne found, I'd appreciate your help. One of them is in Russian. I'm now going to talk a little bit about our terms of use, what we're doing around that, and some of the acquisition workflows that we have. So the data that we have in the UC Berkeley Library Dataverse includes all acquired data that has a license signed by the UC Berkeley Library. And it has to be available to all users without restriction to specific user groups. There are a couple of exceptions for those of you who have worked with business libraries. There will always be those data sets. They're stored locally or they have a subscription. But it must be data-only content. Otherwise, we would open it up to basically all of our resources. And it has to be, you have to be able to manipulate it on either the platform or be able to download it. And this is a pie chart of all of the data that will eventually be in Dataverse. There's still some migrating to do. But we have over half of it will be locally managed. I did break out in the bottom right for you, locally managed data from the Linguistic Data Consortium. They produce quite a lot of data that we get each year. And then we have our vendor managed data or our subscription data. And one of the chunks that I broke out there is vendor managed, but with Wharton Research Data Services. And I decided to break that out separately because they typically have some additional terms of use that we need to be presenting to our users. I should note, we are not taking research data in Dataverse. We direct our users to Dryad or another subject appropriate or discipline appropriate repository for that. We don't have data curators. We don't have the storage. It's not, we just don't have that capability. Plus Dryad's great. With licensing and terms of use, we have a team-based approach, and this supports the licensing librarian. There are about 10 of us, and we review licenses kind of in our format area. So I will review all of the data licenses that come in, and I'll maybe flag a couple of things for the licensing librarian to look at. And then she'll go through and look at things that we need to negotiate, look more into, and give the final okay for us to sign the license once it's been negotiated and send it back to the vendor for countersignature. Anything that she flags as kind of extraordinary or additional gets put into the Dataverse guest book, which is their version of a click-through agreement. So these terms are presented to the user prior to downloading the files. We do have a general mandatory data use terms, and I think of this as kind of the common denominator for all of our data sets. This is a one-page document that was written by Rachel Sandberg, and it's kind of our general terms for all of our data sets that are in Dataverse. This is presented to our user as they are logging in. After they log in through Shibboleth, they get this one page of terms that they have to agree to, and then it lives statically on the Dataverse landing page that they can then refer to at any time. I'm going to close by talking a little bit about our acquisition process. It's really been refined over the years. We have one social sciences librarian who has been on 3 working groups to try to nail down a process, and so I'm hopeful that the third time was his last time of developing a process. A selector can submit a form for either an existing resource, maybe a renewal or a data add-on, or a new resource, and many of them select new resources based on what they're hearing from the researchers and the departments that they support. A JIRA ticket is created, I am added to that ticket, and at that point, I create a new or an initial metadata record in Dataverse. Then comes the licensing process, and that's the point at which I start putting together the guest book or the click-through agreement in Dataverse. Acquisitions will place the order and complete the payment, and then for all of the data that is hosted locally, I then download the data and will load the data into Dataverse. There's a much tighter line of communication between me and the liaison because they've typically talked to me about the data set as they're submitting the ticket for data acquisition. And then the Dataverse record is reviewed with the selector for completion and accuracy, making sure that we're linking to all of the documentation they would like and that we have all of the proper subject terms, notes, the description is what they want it to be. And once that has been reviewed, we then publish the record, and then it's discoverable within our Dataverse for our users to find. One of the big pieces of us implementing Dataverse is that data sets are really expensive. We were buying data sets that were then never discoverable or findable, and people weren't using them. So part of putting together Dataverse is making good on our investment that we've made in all of these data sets over the years. And to give you a sense of numbers, last year we had about 19 new data sets, which is a number that's currently manageable for me to work through with the licensing team and library IT. And at this point, we'll turn it over to you for any questions you may have.
Thanks. So it's really interesting talk. Rebecca Dico from Yale. I'm wondering if you could comment on how you handle any data sets that need to be updated frequently, sort of like the versioning piece. Start with that.
We haven't encountered that too much yet, but that's definitely a factor. And that's something that I really rely on communication with the liaison. We're looking at purchasing a data set that will need to have monthly updates going into this next year. And I guess we have L2, the voter data, which has a lot of updates.
L2 is the big one that I was thinking about, yeah.
So I try to be very organized, and I have documentation for each data set that needs to be updated. I keep track of when new files are uploaded, the day that I uploaded them, and then I send out a message to. For L2, I know exactly who's using it, so I'll send out a message to those users. But once the new files are added, I then communicate that to the liaison. But I think it looks a little bit different for each data set. But for me, it's having a schedule and reminders and just keeping the ball moving with making those updates.
Hi, John Dunn, Indiana University. We're working on addressing some similar challenges, so very interested. Yeah, very interesting presentation. Had a couple of questions, I guess, about scope. Perhaps one is are there any discussions with those outside the libraries who license data for campus, and how this service would play a role for data that gets licensed by other entities within the university, but often for potentially university-wide access? The second question is about very large data sets that might need to live on in storage in an HPC environment or something like that. And are you dealing with that challenge as well?
I'll start with your second question, because that's what we're doing with L2. L2, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is personally identifiable voter information. So at the individual level, so it needs an additional layer of security. So for that, that would be a record only or metadata only record in Dataverse that links to all of our access protocols for that data set. And it does live on, it's called Savio at UC Berkeley. So folks need a faculty compute allowance to be able to access it. So their starting point is that initial record, and then they get in touch with me and the liaison. We are very close partners with Research IT. We have a shared research data management program, and that close collaboration really facilitates access to that data set. And I like to think that because we have that process in place for L2, it'll make it easier for us to then provide access to other data sets that have similar requirements. To address your first question, I kind of wish Rachel Sandberg were still here. We would have to review the license because I think the library has different standards for what we license than a research group or a faculty member who might sign a license. We have been reviewing existing licenses, some that were signed outside of the library, and we've actually gone back and renegotiated terms with those vendors to make sure that updated accessibility is written in and that fair use is preserved. So it's doable, but it takes work to renegotiate to the library standards.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This has been really interesting. I'm Holly Mercer, University of Tennessee. For data sets like L2, do you and I know you have a click-through. Do you have any way to confirm that the user has human subjects research approval? Do you do that ahead of time? Is it up to the user?
So L2 is the only one.
Okay.
We actually have another one that we don't have a process in place for, and so it's not on Dataverse yet because we have to build it. But because L2 is the only one, we have that confirmation in place with the user. And it's not part of the Dataverse process. For the data sets on Dataverse that do have a click-through agreement, we can see who has logged in and created the account and who has filled out the terms of use. So we know who is accessing those data sets and downloading the files after they've gone through the terms of use. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emily Morton Owens from Penn. We're also working on similar things, and I also have an L2 related question. Apologies. We actually have other data sets that have sort of similar qualities of having unique access requirements, and I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail with those. If you have cases where you're giving the user access to a part of a data set, after they have been approved, where is that data stored? What is the mechanism by which you select what they have access to and deliver it to them?
I don't have a case for that yet.
Okay, thanks.
Daniel Castillo, the University of Rochester. I have a similar question. You mentioned you have business data that you keep. Do you put that on Dataverse? And if so, how do you restrict that to the business school?
The majority of the data, and I think it's on the part of the vendors, the majority of the data that we have for business is subscriber. It's subscription data. It's managed on the platform. The few exceptions that I can think of are Rate Watch data and the Data Axle historical business files. And that isn't restricted to the business school, but those do come with click-through agreements. But the rest are managed by the subscriber or by the platform.
Thank you.
I'm happy to talk about L2 after this is over.
And I just want to mention managed by the subscriber is sort of a euphemism for library IT is usually in the middle of that because of, we're the ones who get why did this user get access? Because it shows they graduated last year and they shouldn't have access anymore, which all has to do with Cal groups and what flag they have and can be quite a little bit of a octopus to decipher. So I think for me, like in library IT, the often is people just think it's done. And if we do it well, yes, but if we don't, not so much. But it's very interesting that all of these, and I've learned more about data than I ever thought to.
We're at time. I do want to close by saying that this project is only possible because we have library IT. There is a team of developers who I worked very closely with to build it, who update it, who manage it, and I think institutions trying to do it with just a handful of people, it's a heavy lift. And so having that reliance on library IT has really made it possible and will make it a sustainable platform moving forward.